This is an RNZ podcast.
This is Media Watch. I'm Colin Peacock. Well, as we've heard in this program over recent weeks, there is a bitter boardroom battle playing out at NZME, one of New Zealand's most important news media companies. We check back in on the latest claims and counterclaims between those wrestling for control of the company. And we'll hear from one player in the process who unexpectedly popped up in TV coverage last weekend of the big farewell for Pope Francis in Rome.
One news spotting another Kiwi among those masses.
A complete coincidence. I've been walking a 3-week pilgrimage through Italy. I'm not Catholic myself, but I thought Pope Francis was a great man.
That's later on. We'll also hear how bringing back military service was backed by some big voices in our media.
Off you go to compulsory 6 months in military training.
We've gone soft and we've allowed this, our systems allow this, and we now have to put it right.
You would feel a lot better after a day's physical activity out in the wop-wops.
And it took off on Talkback as well.
I agree with you.
But it was mostly based on some pretty dodgy data. That's coming up as well. But first, assumptions made in the media about important elections were upended in Canberra and in Canada this past week, and it seems Trump's turmoil is part of the reason. So is picking political winners a fool's game now, and one that the media should just steer clear of?
Traffic's still moving. I mean, we actually had to pause it. The mayor had to wait a second before she dug the hole because there was it looked like a sewage truck behind her holding a portaloo that was in the way and making some noise. We waited a second and then the ground was broken, turned over some of that bark, and then we've moved now into the Embassy Theatre for some kai. I just ate a lamington.
That was News Talk ZB reporter Ethan Manera last Monday, phoning in live from outside Wellington's Embassy Theatre, where a sewage truck pulling a portaloo briefly delayed a photo opportunity for the mayor. Tory whānau had just turned the first symbolic sod on the so-called Golden Mile project, a revitalisation of the capital's CBD main drag that's been controversial. And later that day, News Talk ZB's Heather Duplessis-Allen was unimpressed by the mayor's media set piece.
Lame. Like, if this is your big... Or honestly, at one point, there was a bus behind Tory with a portaloo strapped on the back, and I thought this sums everything up. Like, this is the worst event in the history of the world.
Surely there are a few worse things in the world than that. Right now in the news, for example, never mind in history. Anyhow, when Tory whānau told the media on Monday that the Golden Mile was a major milestone in her mayoralty, what she didn't tell the media was that she'd already arranged to give up the job and not stand in October for re-election. Instead, she'll stand aside to give Labour's candidate Andrew Little a clear run. And even though she'd copped huge criticism from ZB's opinionated hosts during her time in charge in the capital, Tory whānau worked exclusively with ZB to get the news out the following morning. She recorded an interview with them that was ready to roll for Ryan Bridges' early edition show on ZB at 5 a.m. on Tuesday, where Andrew Little was also on hand to chat.
In a planned media statement embargoed till 5 o'clock this morning, she's announced she'll instead run for a Māori ward and let Andrew Little take the top job.
I know that he would do a really good job. I hope that people would see it as a gracious move. I'm merely stepping aside because he really wants the role.
Of course, he's got to get elected first, but he's with me this morning. Andrew, good morning.
And the exclusive news about the mayor was also on the front page of ZB's stablemate The Herald, written up by political editor Thomas Coughlin. Now, all that was a bit of a bummer for the capital's daily paper, The Post, which had only a few words from the mayor for its front page piece the same day, and that came in a statement that was supplied by her. But still, The Post can't be all that surprised to be snubbed. Last Christmas, for example, The Post called Tory whānau a lame duck mayor who's blundered from one political disaster to another when it placed her at number 44 out of 50 in its power ranking of top Wellingtonians, while at the same time the paper also said she still had a decent shot at re-election. Anyhow, things have now changed. The same day, Tory whānau also spoke on air to News Talk ZB's Wellington morning host Nick Mills, who's also given the mayor a pretty rough ride in the past, but also a fair hearing. And the morning after that, ZB's national breakfast host Mike Hosking was still choking on what Tory whānau had to say.
What would you score yourself, Tory? She scored herself 9 out of 10. Now, if she had come from comedy, I could have seen the joke she was making, but she doesn't come from comedy, which is not to say her reign hasn't been comedic. She is the Meghan Markle of local body politics, so self-absorbed she doesn't appear cognizant as to just how destructive and useless she is.
Interesting comparison there. The media's obsession with Meghan Markle trivia is something that usually says more about the media and the audience than Meghan Markle herself. And also throwing his 2 cents in on all this was Stuff's columnist Patrick Gower. On Tuesday, he reckoned that a lot of illogical and irrelevant hate for Tory whānau had helped hasten her decision to end her reign. But
I hope the Tory whānau haters realise what they've done. In Andrew Little, Wellington might have its wokest and most lefty mayor yet. Congratulations.
And a few paragraphs later, might have became will have.
Now there is nobody else. Andrew Little is effectively Wellington's mayor-elect.
But that's not what Ray Chung reckoned, according to News Talk ZB's news the next morning.
Ray Chung believes he is still the front-runner for the Wellington mayoralty after Tory whānau dropped out of the race yesterday.
I think that I'm going to win. I think that the Independent Together Party is going to win. We've got 11 candidates out there.
And of course, anything could happen between now and the actual election in October. And as if to make that point, the evidence coming from Canada was all over the news that same morning.
The Liberal Party, led by Mark Carney, has pulled it off. A stunning reversal, a Liberal comeback with a first-time politician as leader. You're looking live there at the Liberal Party headquarters right now.
Stephen Chase from Canada's Globe and Mail paper didn't have to try too hard to answer Alexa Cook's question on RNZ's Morning Report.
You know, what is it really that pushed the Liberals over the line?
It was Donald Trump. Donald Trump saved their bacon.
Straight after that, on Morning Report, they turned to electioneering in Australia, where Anthony Albanese's incumbent Labor government had also been written off, before the tide turned suddenly against the centre-right Liberal Party and its leader Peter Dutton. And former Aussie Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, who also used to lead Dutton's party, told RNZ's Guy Espiner that this was a Trump-flavoured phenomenon too.
The mistake Peter's made is that he's taken his cues from that right-wing media ecosystem, of which Murdoch's media is a big part. And that's the environment Trump lives in, of course, in America, and that a lot of that has played very badly in the electorate.
Now, in the UK, Rupert Murdoch's top tabloid paper used to trumpet it was the Sun what won it every time the Conservative Party won general elections there, after the Sun had endorsed the party. But not so much now, in Australia it seems. And none of this, by the way, had passed by News Talk ZB's Mike Hosking. Last Tuesday, he told his listeners,
Tell you what, for a while there, being a tough guy was good for the old cred, wasn't it? Viktor Orban, Mr Malay, Mr Bukali all revelled and succeeded at the polls in their macho Trump-esque persona. Being like Trump was more often than not good for your political aspirations. Peter Dutton had a touch of that, but sadly in the length of an Australian campaign it's all changed. The more he's looked like Trump, talked like Trump, promised policy that sounded like Trump, the worse it's got.
One day later on News Talk ZB, Mike Hosking told his regular Aussie commentator Steve Price that he thought it had become so bad for Dutton that the election result was a foregone conclusion, the same outcome as in Canada. But Steve Price warned Mike Hosking, now it could be swinging the other way.
I mean, you and I might speak on Monday and I might look like a fool, and polls have got these things wrong. But there seems to be some sort of a comeback this week for the coalition.
And of course, the best way not to look a fool in these turbulent political times is not to try and second-guess the voters in any upcoming election, whether it's in the weekend or next October. And while we all knew that these elections were happening, there'll be one just over a week away that no one could have predicted until recently.
New Zealand's Cardinal John Dew is at the Vatican for the conclave. He told News Talk ZB the blockbuster movie is somewhat representative of the process.
I enjoyed the film. It gave people, I think, a very good idea of what does happen.
That was News Talk ZB News last Monday there, looking ahead to the election of the next Pope. On this week's Midweek Media Watch, I took a look at how the farewell of Pope Francis last weekend turned into a major media event, with internal political tensions in the background as well as international ones complicating the picture in Rome. And there'll be plenty more to play out before the white smoke signifies a result in the meantime. If you missed it, Midweek Media Watch is on the Media Watch podcast page at rnz.co.nz or available for free wherever you get your podcasts. One local news outlet that really pushed the boat out for coverage of the Pope's death and his funeral last weekend was TVNZ, which sent reporter Kate Nicholl-Williams to Rome to report back alongside Europe correspondent May Heron. And they were able to source some Kiwis in the crowds who we wouldn't have heard from otherwise, such as this guy.
It certainly does feel like you've been part of history today, hey?
Yeah, 100%. I think being here for the weekend, if I didn't pop in, my mum would never have forgiven me.
Hope his mum watches One News, and May Heron also picked out a more familiar face from the crowd in St Peter's Square.
Former Labour politician Michael Wood is completing the walk inspired by St Francis of Assisi, from whom the Pope took his papal name.
I'm not Catholic myself, but I thought Pope Francis was a great man, and I think many people around the world did.
Since his time as a Labour MP and a former cabinet minister, Michael Wood has mostly been in the news in a new role, representing the main union for journalists, Air2. Last year, he even took TVNZ to court and won over the way that TVNZ had laid off journalists as part of a major cost-cutting drive. This year, Michael Wood has also spoken out on behalf of journalists at the New Zealand Herald, who are now worried about the outcome of a battle for control of its owner, NZME. Now, that erupted in March when the Canadian expat billionaire James Grennan upped his stake in the company and then launched a bid to change the board at NZME. And all this will come to a head when shareholders next meet a month from now. But Hayden Donnell now catches us up with all the claims and counterclaims of the parties jockeying for position.
Auckland-based Canadian Jim Grennan has told the company's board he wants to remove most of the current directors. Concern is now growing amongst journalists and staff about a possible move or a shift in editorial direction.
That's News Talk ZB's Ryan Bridge back at the beginning of what's turned out to be an elongated bid by the Canadian billionaire Jim Grennan. Shift in editorial direction is one way to put it. Staff were and remain concerned that Grennan is going to use the influence that he'll get on the board to dictate coverage on the subjects that preoccupy his former website, The Centrist, which include vaccine safety, co-governance and climate science. Back when that bulletin went to broadcast, what Stuff called Grennan's billionaire coup seemed almost a foregone conclusion. He'd started out saying he had the support of 37% of NZME shareholders to ditch the company's current directors and install himself and 3 hand-picked candidates on the board. By late March, he was claiming that figure had risen to 47%, just short of the majority needed. But lately, those concerns about editorial independence and Grennan's own media management credentials seem to have been chipping away at his support base. Though he's told the NZME board resistance is futile, he's admitted some of his backers are softening their position. Key NZME shareholder Roger Coleman has tried to get Grennan to temper his ambitions, saying he should get a seat on the board, but not the 3 allies that he wants as well. Meanwhile, the journalists' union Air2 has kept the pressure on, engaging in a battle of open letters with the billionaire. Its first missive, issued on March 13, called on him to guarantee he won't interfere in NZME editorial decisions. He replied with an almost Socratic open letter of his own in late March. More than providing answers, it focused on questions. What is editorial independence? Isn't it already limited by things like editors and advertisers? Shouldn't the board have an interest in editorial content, given it impacts the company's bottom line? The union wrote back, repeating its call for Grennan to commit to editorial independence. It's found allies on NZME's current board, which has said it's concerned that Grennan's takeover bid is an effort to exercise control over a newsroom rather than anything else. The criticism seems to be getting to some in Grennan's camp, who have made a kind of PR push to tamp down on the worry. The former News Talk ZB Plus editor Philip Crump, who Grennan wants to install as the chair of a new NZME editorial board, has penned a blog saying his billionaire backer isn't radical and the Herald won't serve the same purpose as the centrist. He argues journalists will welcome many of his own and Grennan's changes, which would include restoring the Herald's editor to NZME's executive leadership team. But Crump has faced criticism of his own. Etu's most recent reply letter contains a tense and personal quote from union rep Isaac Davison.
Having worked in the same newsroom as Philip Crump, we do not believe he has the experience, ability or mana to take on what would be an influential role.
We invited Crump on to talk over some of those points. Though his blog encourages everyone, including shareholders, journalists and readers, to engage with their vision for NZME, he said no. while not ruling out a future appearance. In the meantime, E2 organiser Michael Wood agreed to discuss the status of the alleged coup and whether journalists are feeling any relief at the soothing noises emanating from Grennan's camp.
No, it hasn't, because at the very same time as making that statement, Mr. Grennan has refused on multiple occasions to make a very clear affirmation that he will respect editorial independence by not intervening in editorial processes at NZME. He's gone on record as saying that he wants to act as an owner-operator, that he wants to delve into operational affairs, which by nature in a news media organisation involves editorial issues. He has proposed to set up an editorial board, which he will stack with some of the key people involved in his bid to take over the organisation. So at the same time as making that comment, many of the other things that he is saying very clearly would undermine editorial independence at NZME, one of our biggest media organisations.
What would a commitment to editorial independence look like? What kind of statement would you want from him?
The first is for a clear and unambiguous statement that he does support editorial independence, and we've set out what that means by reference to NZME's own code, which means not applying external or internal influence into the editorial direction of and decisions of the organisation.
But then he says that he supports that code when you ask him.
Well, I think as a matter of fact, a number of his statements are contradictory when you are saying that you intend to be an owner and operator, that you intend to delve into operational detail, and when you have a track record, as Mr. Grennan does, of clearly wishing to push a particular agenda in the news media setting. It's worth just saying this is not just an E2 concern. This is a concern which has come through from the Shareholders Association because they're worried that it could undermine the value of NZME. It's a concern which has come through from previous editors of the New Zealand Herald, that Mr. Grennan just doesn't seem to understand or appreciate what editorial independence actually is.
Jim Grennan's letter back to you was almost Socratic in nature. It was filled with questions. What is editorial independence? There are limits on it right now. Journalists don't have complete autonomy. They can't defame people. There are limits set on it by ethics bodies like the Media Council, by editors. There are agendas that are set, including in the company's annual report recently, to print positive news. Now, what do you make of that? Is what he intends to do so different from what journalists are already constrained by?
I wouldn't describe it as Socratic. Socrates tended to ask questions in order to shed light on the situation and provide more information and assist with understanding. Look, we don't think that NZME is a perfect organisation, but we do not see the kind of systemic interference in editorial decision-making that there are legitimate concerns around Mr. Grennan doing.
But you don't know that he's going to do that, right? You just suspect that he is going to systemically interfere in editorial decision-making.
We can go to Mr. Grennan's own statements where he has repeatedly said that he intends to get engaged in the operational affairs of this news media organisation. We are very, very used to there being changes to the corporate ownership of news media organisations in New Zealand. We know that news media owners have their own views about the world. The issue here is that one of the bedrocks of a free and open media is that whoever owns that media outlet doesn't come in and override the work of journalists in getting about and bringing stories to the fore, asking questions, saying where they can go and where they can't go.
When I think about what his intentions, as stated, seem to be, they're almost less, I want to direct your existing coverage. They're almost like additional stuff. They're like a positivist ambition. He wants you to cover co-governance issues. He wants you to cover all these things. Is that also bad, that he wants to add different coverage of different topics like climate science?
That's kind of the point here, isn't it? The principle of editorial independence means that the people who own the news media organisation shouldn't be bringing their own particular predispositions and set of interests into telling journalists what they should or shouldn't be reporting on or putting more or less emphasis on. Those are areas, vaccine scepticism, climate scepticism, a set of views around LGBT issues, Māori and treaty issues and wealth tax, that he thinks there should be a particular focus on. Well, fair enough if those are his views, but the journalists at NZME shouldn't be getting told by a billionaire owner, that they should be doing more work on those things or asking particular questions or not asking particular questions on those issues.
Now, you mentioned Philip Crump. Now, you've actually replied to Grennan's reply to you, and in that reply to the reply, Isaac Davison, the Herald's union rep for Etu, he's relatively scathing about Philip Crump and the plan to install him as a chair of an editorial board. What do you think of that idea of an editorial board? Are you opposed to that, just on principle?
Well, not necessarily, and a part of the proposal for Mr. Grennan here is to have Mr. Crump, who is clearly, one of his partners in this takeover proposal, heading up that board. But for Mr. Crump, who doesn't actually have any serious news media experience, to be put in charge of that operation does pose some serious concerns as to the way in which that editorial board would be used to try and control the newsroom.
Yeah, in the statement, Davison's quote is that we do not, so that's the members of the union, do not believe that he has the experience, ability or mana to take on what would be an influential role. That's quite... is that informed by the members working with Mr. Crump when he was head of News Talk ZB+?
Well, I'd put it to you this way. Journalism is a profession, okay? It's a profession which is highly skilled, which is very important in our society, in our democracy, and generally in their professional bodies, you have people who come out of that profession and understand the texture and the history of how it actually works. And so I think what you're seeing from Isaac's statement there is that journalists would have much greater confidence in an editorial board concept if you had people who actually came out of journalism, who had experience in how it works and all of the tensions and issues that come out of it. And, Mr. Crump might well have other qualities.
He's a lawyer by trade, not a journalist. So they would
Correct.
prefer an editor or a journalist that has had a long career.
Well, I think that would be a far more orthodox and reasonable and sensible way of constructing an editorial board. Would you put you or me on a professional body that was overseeing the work of doctors?
Absolutely.
Probably not a great idea.
Oh, sorry. Now, I mean, Philip Crump, he's recently put out a blog post as Substack. He says that fears about editorial independence are overblown, that neither he nor Grennan are radicals. Did you read that blog post?
Yes, I have.
And you were calmed by that?
What they sort of want to do with this is turn it into a bit of a political back and forth about their views are underheard in the public realm.
But they're worried that you and many others, I guess commentators, are trying to paint them as these kind of radicals. They think that they actually are concerned about independent and unbiased journalism, that they don't have extreme views, that they're relatively sober people, and certainly the blog post is written in a relatively sober way. You don't buy that?
Well, it would be a more credible argument to make if these people, going back to where we started, were willing and prepared to make that very clear and very unambiguous commitment to editorial independence, that there will not be external or internal forces which attempt to influence what is happening in the newsroom and the work the journalists do. And they will not do that. Mr. Crump does not make that affirmation in his piece. We have the evidence in terms of the way that Mr. Grennan has engaged in media to date.
Well, Philip Crump rightly notes it's a lot of the stuff that Grennan and him have said they want to do is actually stuff that's probably supported inside the newsroom. For instance, they want to elevate the Herald editor to an executive level role again. They're sceptical about the Herald's video strategy, which I know there is some scepticism about inside the newsroom. They don't particularly like this recent positivist direction about supporting New Zealand's economic recovery. I mean, isn't that correct? That what they've actually said they want to do is actually probably supported by a lot of people in the newsroom.
There are areas where there probably could be some changes and improvements, and where we as a union representing journalists might even have a critique of current policy. But none of that overrides the central concern about editorial independence, because once you give that over, it's very difficult to get it back.
Another thing that has been a concern, basically no one is speaking out. He's issued a lot of letters, there's been a war of the letters, but you seem to be the only person that has spoken out in this sort of a setting, an interview setting, on the record.
Look, someone coming in and attempting to take over New Zealand's largest media organisation, isn't just a matter of private commercial interest, it is a matter of public interest. And the people who are involved in what is, let's face it, a pretty audacious exercise should be willing to come forward and face some scrutiny around this. They should be willing to do that in the media. We have in our letters to Mr. Grennan said we would like to meet with you. These are the working journalists of NZME, to have a grown-up round-the-table conversation to talk through these issues on either side. He's refused to do that so far. And I think it's probably one of the things that is causing some shareholders some concern as well, that there's a bit of opaqueness about how this is unfolding and about who's involved. And of course, we have had the story come out about the fact that the Free Speech Union were quite open about the fact that they sort of shoulder-tapped Mr. Grennan because they had a beef about some of NZME's
decisions not to accept certain
around advertising. Yeah, so it's kind of legitimate questions about who's behind it, what the motivation actually is, whether it is a commercial proposition or whether there's a political, cultural project that's at play as well. And yeah, we think there is an onus on him given the significance of this organisation. I mean, it's not the Waikakamukau Chronicle here we're talking about.
And it's probably relatively galling from a journalist's perspective too, because they have some significant, the Grennan camp has some significant criticisms about stuff like bias in the media and journalistic ethics. It's probably relatively galling that they aren't willing to front up to journalistic questioning while making these critiques.
I think that's right. There is an irony there. He has been critical as well, for example, about some of NZME's openness in respect of their financial reporting, which, there are arguments on both sides of that. He should apply that same standard of openness to the way that he is going about this.
Another thing that's been going on during this saga is that NZME has introduced a form of performance pay where it seems like journalists will be getting bonuses based on how many subscribers they convert or how many clicks their stories generate. Is that something that the union also has concerns about?
Well, the core pay system for journalists at NZME is negotiated in the collective agreement between Ed2 and NZME, and it's not a performance-based pay framework. It's based around the competency of journalists and then meeting those competency standards. There is then an additional layer over the top of that, which is as you've just described. Ed2 does have a concern, not just at NZME, but across news media organisations in general, about the fact that yes, organisations do need to attract audience, but that should be balanced against other concerns in terms of the quality of news. And we would be concerned if that goes too far in terms of incentivising journalists just to do the stuff that gets clicks and eyeballs.
Yeah, if you get rewards for how many clicks you get, that might dictate what sort of coverage that you provide.
Well, that's right. And obviously that is a part of what we're seeing at the moment. The NZME website is algorithmically driven, and so what you see and what I see is very much driven by an assessment of what's going to appeal to us and what we're going to click on. And I don't think that's a particularly healthy development.
You had a bit of a random experience with the news media recently. You're doing a pilgrimage in Italy and ended up in Rome for the Pope's funeral. And what happened? You were walking down the street and saw One News?
Yeah, that's right. I was doing this 3-week pilgrimage walk called the Via di Francesco, which sort of goes between Florence and Rome. It's based around the life of St. Francis of Assisi. And I just ended up in Rome on the day of the Pope's funeral procession. As I was walking back to catch the bus through a throng of about 300,000 people, there was May Heron.
There's this you bearded on the street giving a quote.
Yeah,
for
it was my scruffiest ever interview, I think, on that particular day.
Well, it's great that they still have people over there, but also it's a reminder that we don't have the resources that we once did.
Well, that's right. I mean, it was quite a significant week because, of course, there was the Pope's funeral, which was a major world event, but there was also Christopher Luxon's visit to the United Kingdom. And I think you do want to have a New Zealand perspective on these sorts of events. You do want to have a decent gallery when you have your leader meeting world leaders and applying some scrutiny and asking questions about that. So it was good that One News and Whakata Māori were there. There have been very significant cutbacks, obviously, in terms of their capacity, in terms of their newsroom. But that European correspondent role that Mayheron currently fills is a very important one, and good that they've retained that in the meantime. And look, it's certainly our hope that they, along with other media organisations, are able to rebuild some of that capacity in newsrooms. Otherwise, what we will just get increasingly are feeds from foreign newsrooms which won't apply the New Zealand lens and ask the questions that New Zealanders will be interested in.
Thank you very much for joining me, Michael Wood.
Thank you.
That was Michael Wood, the negotiation specialist at the trade union E2, which represents New Zealand journalists, including some of those at the Herald, currently concerned about the outcome of the bitter boardroom battle at their employer, NZME. And on June the 3rd, shareholders in NZME will vote on the proposal for change at the top, led by the billionaire expat shareholder from Canada, James Grennan. Last week, Anzac Day fell on a Friday, the day that the former lobbyist and right-leaning political pundit Matthew Hooton has his weekly opinion piece in the New Zealand Herald, and on Anzac Day he floated the notion of national service. Now, the first half of that was actually all about the deep financial problems the country's got right now, but Matthew Hooton went on to propose getting a bit more of a social bang out of the big bucks that, like it or not, we'll soon be spending on defence. Outward bound for everyone, Matthew Hooton called it, but with added military skills, and also
adulting skills like cooking, cleaning, changing a tyre and making a school lunch, skills their Gen X and Gen Y parents have failed to teach them or develop themselves.
70,000 New Zealanders turn 18 each year, said Matthew Hooton, so this would be a major undertaking. But he reckoned about 9,000 of those aren't in employment, education or training, so they're already costing taxpayers. Many nations, including several in the EU, also have compulsory national military service, and there could be real social benefits to introducing it here. And Matthew Hooton's big idea got a big hearing on the Herald's talk radio stablemate News Talk ZB this week.
Coming up, Matthew Hooton has suggested it could be a good idea, and we're keen to chat to you about that.
I like it.
Yep, me too. 9292 is the text number.
Now, 30 years ago, when he was a young Gen Xer, Matt Heath created the irreverent youth TV show Back of the Y. Back then, you wouldn't have picked him to be endorsing universal military service for young Kiwis today, 30 years later. But he got universal backing from his News Talk ZB afternoon talkback callers last Monday, most of them boomer-aged or beyond.
Kids who've got ADHD and some sort of kids on the spectrum could actually benefit a lot from it.
Though ZB's Matt Heath reckoned the problem wasn't young people on the spectrum, but on their phones.
There's a lot of talk about brain rot and how bad they feel after there's been a whole day on a phone. And there's no doubt that you would feel a lot better after a day's physical activity out in the wop-wops.
Earlier that day, Bring Back Military Service also got big backing on ZB in Wellington.
But I love the idea. We're not talking about someone that wants to be a doctor, a teacher, an apprentice mechanic. We're talking about directionless people and giving them a damn direction. What's wrong with it?
Well, for one thing, universal or compulsory military service would also capture the would-be doctors, traders and tradies, or the more than 60,000 out of 70,000 school leavers who are in work, education or training and not directionless.
1 in 4 15 to 19-year-olds in New Zealand do not have a job. 25% of young, healthy New Zealanders don't have work. Off you go to compulsory 6 months in military training.
But while 25% of those teenagers do not have a job, as Nick Mills said there, that's because many of them are still at school or university or polytech and preparing to find a job or get more skills. But Nick Mills' callers, most of whom sounded like their working lives were long behind them, still loved the sound of military service for today's young Kiwis.
I agree with you. There should be some sort of compulsory military service for those that are physically capable of it.
And another who liked the idea but really didn't sound that capable was Bruce.
I couldn't agree more. Very excuse me.
You right there, Bruce? Can you have a glass of water? Can you breathe some air? I don't want you choking live on the show.
Very good idea. It should be universal.
Now, while Bruce had trouble getting his words out there, it might have been better if the next caller hadn't, when he brought up Muhammad Ali's defiance of the draft during the Vietnam War in the 1960s.
No Vietnamese, no Viet Cong ever called me I think was his favourite quote.
Whoa. Can't say that.
Hey, mate, whoa. Yeah.
Sounds like they could do with a bit of compulsory training on the use of the on-air dump button at the ZB studio in Wellington. Meanwhile, another columnist fretting last weekend about the feckless and jobless younger generation here was Duncan Garner, and he was riffing off the same stat that was aired by Newstalk ZB's Nick Mills. Last week, his editor-in-chief podcast was headlined like this.
1 in 4 15 to 19-year-olds are not employed, not working, not in education or training. 1 in 4, 25%.
The stats don't lie, Duncan Garner went on to say in his podcast and in his latest column for The Listener as well. But that figure of 1 in 4, which is actually 23.8% according to Stats NZ data to the end of 2024, includes 15 to 19-year-olds who are still in school, university or in training. The proportion that really is not in employment, education or in training, the so-called NEETs, is only about half that, or 13.2% at December 2024, the last official quarterly figure available. But in his Listener article, Duncan Garner lamented tens of thousands of young men and women who don't attend school, work or some form of training, and who are, he says, idle at home. The last Ministry for Social Development Insights report back in 2023 found that the number under 25 receiving a main benefit was 39,000, but only about half of those were getting the job seekers allowance. It'll be a bit more than that by now, but there would be roughly 20,000 under 25s currently classed as work-ready but not working, learning or training today. But on his podcast, Duncan Garner made it sound like there was a generation of unemployables who need bootcamp and also enforced digital detoxification.
They're not working, they're gaming, they're on social media, some platform. Doom scrolling is what they call it. Not doing much at all. Not in work, but caught in their own vortex, basically. That is their device. And the stats don't lie. 1 in 4. And when you widen that out, it's 13% of 15 to 24-year-olds.
Though, as we've heard, the reality is a lot less alarming stats-wise than Duncan Garner reckons it is. Now, for further insight on this, he then turned to a Bay of Plenty-based life and career coach, Tina Akuhata, who, she said, had worked on getting people back into work here and in Australia.
What's been happening since 15 years ago, I left this country and I've come back and everyone's, I've got this generous welfare system. And I said, is that a deliberate attempt to create more government dependency in this country and keep the gravy train going? I'm not sure. Yeah, my conspiracy theory is it's been quite deliberate.
But a conspiracy to embed dependency on an overly generous welfare system seemed to be just an idea of Tina's. So it is true that unemployment is bigger and growing faster among 15 to 19-year-olds here in New Zealand than for any other age group, and the rate of young people who are not in employment, education or training went up more than 1% in the quarter to December, the last period where stats are available. That's to 13.2%, and that is clearly not good. But in the past decade, the previous annual peak was 12.8%. That was in the year to March 2021. And the low in the past decade was 11.2%, just 2 years later. And even when we had a so-called rockstar economy back in the 2010s, the rate didn't go below 11.5%. Now, currently, unemployment for 15 to 24-year-olds is significantly lower in Australia, as Tina Akuhata told Duncan Garner. But in the first 2 months of this year alone, it climbed from 8% in Australia to over 10%. Even so, MediaWatch couldn't find panicky comment in the media there, claiming there's a lost generation of jobless, directionless young Australians heading straight to the social welfare scrap heap, clutching their digital devices. In his Listener article, Duncan Garner did acknowledge, in passing, that older people here are working longer, and we've also had record immigration in recent years. And an analysis of youth unemployment by Burl that was published in March confirmed that there is much more competition now for the jobs that younger Kiwis need. But Burl's analysis also found that the labour force participation rate for 15 to 24-year-olds actually increased in the last quarter of 2024 by 2.5% to 66.4% overall. And Burl's conclusion was this.
They are eager to work. It could also mean that youth and young adults are exploring other avenues of occupation, such as tertiary education, including vocational education.
And also Australia. The brain drain could become a brain flood, Burl warned, to take advantage of the stronger job market. In which case, the prospect of compulsory military service would surely become another push factor for thousands of young Kiwis who do have education, training and plans. if the main problem is really an underperforming and unproductive economy, then putting young people with prospects into national service alongside a much smaller number of unemployables, apparently addicted to their phones and to welfare, well, that's hardly going to help. And those in the media loudly quoting misleading stats this week on our younger generation could deploy a bit of the discipline that they claim is lacking in the young. That's it for this weekend. Thanks for listening. We'll be back again next week. And if you have any thoughts to share or ideas for us to follow up, or you spot anything in the media you think we should know about, do get in touch. Email us, mediawatch@rnz.co.nz, or you'll also find us at MediaWatchNZ on X. And you can even write us a letter and send it to Media Watch, PO Box 123, Wellington. Hayden Donnell will be back next Wednesday with Midweek Media Watch. Catch you then. In the meantime, follow Media Watch and listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any podcast app to make sure you never miss an episode.